to the general unsupervised architecture. And the idea behind this is that there is a way to train a wide variety of neural networks in an unsupervised way. So one famous way of doing things like this is with Autoencoder, but an autoencoder is kind of tied to a particular architecture. What we're going to be talking about is a more general approach. So LSTMs maybe could be done this way. All sorts of other things potentially could be done this way. Now, so let's just go through, for comparison's sake, just to get our terminology. So we have input here, where we have input nodes, and then with the autoencoder we have compression happening because there's fewer nodes here than in the input. So there is compression here, and then we have an output which is actually the same target image, or whatever it is, the signal that we get in the input. So the input and the output match, and hopefully there is some kind of compression happening here. Well, that's really good, but sometimes we have to consider things if we have a very complicated scene. Okay, so let's say we're taking natural image pictures, okay, and we're going to compress it down to some very compressed representation. So a fairly substantial image of 1,000 by 1,000 pixels is going to be compressed down to 50 nodes. And in that case, it's actually not easy to go back from this full representation to that full representation, because actually in this compression process we might be losing some kind of important data. So when it's compressed that far down, even though there is this concept maybe of a zebra inside here, and there is a concept of a lion inside here, and the grass and the savanna and all of that, basically how these things are placed, where are they in the scene, there's so many details to take care of that it's actually difficult to match pixel for pixel how things were in the input when we consider the output from this compressed image. So is there anything that we can do about that? And the answer is possibly yes. So the idea here, and this looks identical, the network looks identical, but the idea is actually a very different one. So here we have an input also, a bunch of nodes that represent some kind of input, let's say an image. And then we have some kind of compressed layer here. But what is our target? And this is the key difference. Whereas in the autoencoder, our target was the same as our input. Here, our target is something else. So our target, in this case, we are putting in only 4 different images because there's 4 nodes possible for the output. And then what we have is a one hot vector. For each input, the vector has only one node active and all the other ones are off. So basically, we're no longer trying to replicate, if you will, the original image. Okay, we're just trying to learn some kind of a representation that would allow us to pick, to describe a scene in a way that would allow it to be picked from an album of pictures. So that's the key concept to understand here. That's the key difference. And so imagine now you're solving a problem and somebody gives you a photo album and says, okay, find a way to compress what all of these pictures, each picture into some vector, and I look at that vector, and from that vector, or that vector could, you would imagine, be a sentence, that vector would tell me where to, which picture it is in the album. And actually, that's much more doable than recreating the whole picture. So, for example, if we describe like a picture that says, you know, a boy is wearing a blue hat. Okay, so we could look through all of the pictures and find, yes, there is a picture with a boy in a blue hat. And that's doable. Whereas a picture that has to, or a compressed representation that has to describe everything about the scene, including the fact that there's a boy there and there's a blue hat and where are they in the scene and what's all the other stuff in the scene. That's actually a lot harder to compress down in a meaningful way that would give a genuine, that would genuinely replicate what was what was the input. So, okay, so I did this actually with something very, very basic, edge detector. So I wanted to see if I could generate something that looks like an edge detector if I would do something like this. So here in these nodes, I had 1,000 nodes that had a circular that drew data from a circular region of an image, and I would switch. I don't remember exactly how many thousands of images, well, not the whole images, just the 1,000 pixels out of each image, and they were all circular areas of images, and then I would try here, let's say I had 10,000 images. I don't remember how much I had. And if I had 10,000 images, then here there would be 10,000 nodes. Okay, so it would be quite a big network here on the output. And so there was like a compressed representation. I picked an arbitrary number. I think it was 50, something like that. And then I just trained the network. I was trying to guess what did I see. I was trying to guess which picture am I looking at by looking at the input. And in fact, what I saw was, there was learning taking place during this process. But after the process was stopped, I would take each one of these middle nodes, each one of these, and then basically look at the connections that it has made to the input layer. Okay, and what you are going to see here is actually all of the nodes that represent input layers. What each node in the compressed layer is actually looking for in the input layer. And what can be kind of seen is that this is kind of working and it's kind of not working. So what's clearly seen is there's some kind of edge detectors, okay? And that's actually a pretty good sign because, in fact, in the computer vision, the first level of processing is just about always edge detectors. So that's really very promising. But on the other hand, some of these nodes basically don't train to anything, it seems. And some of these nodes look pretty similar to each other. So that's not a very encouraging sign. So we're not operating at an optimum here, but there's signs of life, and that's important. Okay, so that's with the edge detectors. Then I wanted to see what could I do with a more complex data set. So the data set that I chose was a MNIST data set. And for those not in the know, basically it's a data set of digits that just look like this, these digits right here. And there is like 60,000 of them in the training set and like 10,000 of them in the test set. And basically, okay, so what was the plan? What were we looking for? Well, what we were looking to do is we were looking to train a sophisticated network. So there's a pretty good, it's not the latest and the greatest state of the art. The latest and the greatest state of the art does something like 99.8% accuracy or something. This one does 99.6% accuracy. So the idea is to take this network, which is like a multi-layer, like 6 or 7 layers with pooling, which is a lossy operation. So like it's a multi-layer thing. So it's no longer just input that goes directly to the compressed representation. It's input that goes and the input is like 700. I don't remember exactly. It's around 700 nodes, and then it goes through like 6 layers or so with pooling, and then eventually it ends up at a compressed representation here of 50 nodes. So I would basically take a subset of the data, because I couldn't take 60,000 due to some technical difficulties I would discuss later. I could only take 10,000, or later I took 20,000, but that takes up a lot more computational resources. So 10,000, I took 10,000, and so that means there's 10,000 nodes here on the target output, and it's a one hot. This is very sparse, and I'm sure it's going to get you suboptimal results, but it is what it is, okay? So it's still got an interesting result. And so basically what ended up happening with such a setup is that unsupervised learning was done with something like that. And there was, so as it says here, multi-layer network starts with input and narrows down to 50 nodes, which are fed to softmax, one hot target of 20,000, so that was later, nodes, one node for each possible input picture. Okay, so then what was done is, when it was run through, when the training was finally finished with, and we had our network, we ran it through all of the pictures that were actually processed, okay? And what ended up happening was that we ended up with a 50 node vector representation of each picture. And so we had, in this case, 20,000 of these compressed images. So compressed down to 50 numbers. And what was done then is we would try to train another network to go from the 50 to now do the supervised task of going to from 50 to predicting if it's a 0 or a 1 or a 2 or a whatever, 8 or a 9. You know, all 10 of them. So then instead of doing a supervised task on the whole thing, we did an unsupervised task and compressed everything down to 50. Did something like clustering, kind of, and then we just did the learning on those 50 to see if it goes between 0, 1, 2, down to 8, 9. So what was discovered was that the results were interesting. They got better and better, but still no cigar. And one of the things that makes these experiments difficult is that mini batch cannot be done, or gradient, stochastic gradient descent. It has to be done in a one big batch, which eats up RAM. And that's the only way I managed to get it to really work. And that's a very big downside, because to train 20,000 images on 1,000 iterations, that takes 3 days. If you want 5,000 iterations, it takes 20 days or so. So what were the kind of results that were obtained anyways with this kind of learning? So it depends on the combination of inputs, so how many pictures were in the sample, and then also it depends on the the number of iterations. So the more inputs and the more iterations, things work pretty well, but it seems to top off, or maybe there is some kind of overlearning happening. I'm not entirely sure what's going on, but this particular way of doing things here with the most inputs and most iterations is actually less than this way with like less iterations. So the problem, yeah, as mentioned before, it takes a very great deal of time. So maybe there is a combination of inputs and iterations that could be even better, 92, 93, maybe even 94, 95, nobody knows, okay? And maybe there is a different architecture that could also do better as well. No guarantees here. I didn't try anything different, but yeah, so it can be tried. But the problem with this whole thing is, why can't it be published as it is right now? So when the same experiment is done with an autoencoder, basically the autoencoder, just a very simple autoencoder, not a stacked autoencoder, nothing like that. Just a straightforward input, compressed output. Autoencoder gets a 95% rate success on the same task with the same amount of nodes in the compressed representation. It's also not easy to, one of the claims of this approach is that it might be possible to give this as a general approach. There's no real reason why it can be restricted to the convolutional neural networks that I tried, but it's difficult to prove generality, or why would it be any good there. And it's difficult to actually compare against other methods. It can be used as a clustering algorithm, but I'm not sure how to compare clustering other algorithms very well. So the other reason why it's kind of difficult, if I have to prove the effectiveness of this approach in some fashion, I have to usually apply it to some field that already has a highly evolved approach, like speech recognition or computer vision of some kind, recognition of objects or something. So that's the big question. How did you take a novel, simple approach that's clearly underdeveloped, doesn't have millions of hours of man time on it, and man hours? So I don't, it's how does that surpass something that's already highly evolved? So some kind of collaboration with somebody in the lab would be great, if possible. And also, I didn't mention one other possible way of showing that this might be useful could potentially be to use it as a pre-training tool. I have not done that. Maybe this is something that could allow for less usage of labels, possibly. So that we know that unlabeled data is plentiful, but labeling it's what costs money. So if this could be modified to greatly decrease the need for labels, that would be great, but actually needs to be somehow proven that that could be done. And at this point in time, I'm not entirely sure if I could really prove it. But anyways, that's the deal for now. So thank you very much for listening for 20 whole minutes. Okay, bye.